Volume.
Yeah, I guess we'll start now. Hello guys, Science Club welcomes all of you to the theme talk series of Science Day. Today we have Dr. KP Mohanan talking on the symmetry in theoretical linguistics. Dr. Mohanan, or we'll just call him Mo for now because I believe that's what he prefers. Mo did his BSc from Kerala University on the top in physics, and his MA in English literature from Meerut University, and his MS and PhD in linguistics from MIT. He served in various positions all across the globe in a lot of different places like University of Austin, Texas, National University of Singapore, Stanford, MIT. And he joined the Isopune faculty in 2011 and retired in 2016. He's also been a part of an organization, ThinkU, which is dedicated to developing learners' capacity to think, inquire, integrate, and question. His research interest is in linguistic theory and the transdisciplinarity of academic knowledge and modes of inquiry in educational philosophy and inquiry-based pedagogy. So, Mo, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm supposed to be representing two things. One is theoretical linguistics, and the other is the transdisciplinary inquiry and transdisciplinary education. One remark before I begin, a lot of people think that theoretical linguistics is part of humanities and social sciences. It's a branch of cognitive science. So it's part of the sciences of the mind. It is not a social science, nor is it a humanities discipline. So I would like to say I represent the sciences of the mind, and its connections are on the one hand to computer science. On the one hand, that's because that's where it originated, and the other to such things as neuroscience. Okay, so what I would like to do today is to begin with a broad concept of the symmetry, such that it applies to all disciplines, and then come down slowly to symmetry in linguistics. I would like this to be a conversation. So I don't want to give a lecture. So I would encourage all of you to ask questions, comments, and roughly along the way Anirban did in the morning. So please turn on the videos so that I can see you and we can have a conversation. That's what I would like to do. All right. So please turn on the videos and please ask questions, interrupt me anytime you want, anytime you don't want also. So let me see if I can turn on my slides. Okay, I think. Okay, can all of you see the slide? Can you see the slide? Can you say yes or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
all right. I would prefer to hear yes more instead of yes sir. Okay. So let me begin. So as I said, theoretical linguistics is a human science that investigates the human mind-brain as a cognitive science. And as I said, it's a branch of the sciences of the mind. It is not a social science and not a humanities discipline. So let me begin with what I understand as symmetry in mathematics, then I will go on to other disciplines from there. Here is the Wikipedia description of symmetry. The description says symmetry is usually used to refer to an object that is invariant under some transformations, including translation, reflection, rotation, or scaling. That's a good starting point. And I would like to proceed to remove the change metaphor, the process metaphor in symmetry and transformation. Let's see how it can be done. So you could say that symmetry is what remains unchanged in a process of change. A transformation, you can say, is a change, but what is unchanged is the symmetry. And you can proceed to say it is invariance under variability. There is something that is variable, but you also find something that is invariant under variability. How do you connect these two? The first part is process of change, and the other is variability can be interpreted as variation which is changing or simply differences. So let me begin with the notion of change in order to connect that to symmetry. What is change? We can say that a change is simply a difference along the dimension of time. So suppose you are given two photographs, one that of a 3-year-old, another one that of a 30-year-old. You will describe the differences in terms of just difference. So one has a mustache, the other doesn't have a mustache. One is chubby cheeks, the other is beard, and so on. But if you're told that it is the same person, 3-year-old and 30-year-old, and there is a time lag of 27 years, the moment time comes into effect, you say it's a change. So change is nothing but a difference along the dimension of time. We can now remove the change metaphor and simply say difference is what counts, and sameness within difference. That's what symmetry is about. This is going to be important for the entire discussion of symmetry in this talk. Okay, so we can say symmetry is that which is the same in two different things. All right, so far okay? If there are questions, please ask. I'll proceed slowly. All right, so that the idea that symmetry is invariance under variability, we have removed the time part in symmetry, just describe it as difference. The time will come in later if you want to describe symmetry in processes as opposed to symmetry in structures. When you talk about structure, time doesn't appear, but when you're talking about process, time does appear. So I need to separate the two parts. Okay. Another aspect of symmetry is that symmetry is actually a process of abstraction, because what you're doing is really ignoring the differences and focusing upon what things have in common. And that's essentially abstraction. Okay, what is abstraction? Abstraction is the process that identifies what is essential and what is relevant and ignore what is non-essential and non-relevant. And in the case of symmetry and transformation, what we are trying to do is to say what is essential for my purposes is that which is common, that which is shared, that which is invariant. So perceiving symmetry is actually a process of abstraction. That is how we perceive symmetry, by abstracting. So there is a central connection between these two things, symmetry and abstraction. Right. Now, I have been talking at a very abstract level, so let me take some examples now to show what I mean by that statement. So let's consider symmetry in parrots. Take a look at these 6 pictures. Can you identify the parrots in this picture? Can you say these are parrots and those are not? Some of these pictures are those are parrots and others are not. If you can identify parrots and you can identify non-parrots, then you already have some form of symmetry in your mind of parrots. That is to say, there are differences across parrots. For example, some parrot may be green, others may be red, some may be blue, some may have short beak, others may have long beak or hook beak. All kinds of differences exist, and yet you see all of them as parrots, and you can separate the non-parrots from this list. That is essentially symmetry in parrots. Now, it may not be easy to identify and articulate explicitly what you mean by parrot. But if you can say this in terms of sentences, when I say parrot, I mean such and such, and you explicitly articulate the symmetry, then what you're getting is a definition of parrots. A definition is supposed to identify parrots and separate parrots from non-parrots. So by perceiving symmetry and articulating what you see as symmetry, you get a definition. I'm trying to connect the notion of symmetry to invariance, to definition, to theory, and a whole bunch of other things. So far, okay? Now, let's move from parrots to birds. If you are given a bunch of pictures of a number of creatures, can you say these are birds and those are not birds? When you say that, you have moved up the level of abstraction from parrot to bird. This is a greater abstraction. That would be symmetry of birds. Again, if you can say that in sentences, you have given a definition of birds. And you might end up constructing a theory of birds if you can pursue in that trajectory. All right. Now let's move from birds to vertebrates. That's relatively easy, but identifying vertebrates without actually looking at the insides, that may not be the same. But you can still say these are vertebrates and those are not without actually doing, opening up the creature and looking at the bone inside. Let's move from vertebrate to animal. If you're given a large number of living organisms, can you say these are animals and those are not? If you can say that, you have moved up another notch of abstraction and identified symmetry of animals such that you can distinguish what is shared by animals and what is not, what is shared by other creatures. You have identified, in other words, the invariance of animals in spite of all the variability, from all the way from worms to humans. Now let's move up further. Can you identify living organisms? That is, as far as biology is concerned, that's the highest level of an abstraction. That is symmetry. If you can say living organisms are such and such, state that in sentences, whether in terms of structure or a function or behavior, it doesn't matter. You have identified the core of life. So what we have done is move from parrots to living organisms in gradual steps of abstraction. And that essentially is symmetry. That is what we mean by invariance under variability. There is huge variability in biological organisms, and yet you are able to say these are living organisms, those are not. So far, okay? Any questions about that before I proceed to other kinds of things? All right. So this is a kind of broad picture of symmetry. We'll now go on to examine the different kinds of symmetry in different disciplines. All right, let's take symmetry in biology. Quite often, symmetry in biology is seen as visual symmetry, the spatial geometric symmetry, and that too is seen as bilateral symmetry. Okay, but what is bilateral symmetry? So everybody would agree, if you look at my hands, that I have bilateral. This is symmetry. But notice that if I do this, okay, here is bilateral. If I do this, they don't match quite. Okay, I'll have to do something of this kind, and I'll have to do this. By doing this, let me take some actual. Here is these are my hands. I just scan them. Okay, notice that if I do this, they don't match. Okay. If I do this, they don't match. What I have to do is,
You need to stop sharing the screen in order for that to be visible.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm sorry. I have been told that for you to see what I was doing, I need to stop sharing screen. Let me repeat. Okay, bilateral symmetry of my hands. All right. If I do this, okay, there is no bilateral symmetry. To perceive bilateral symmetry, I have to do this. And in order to do that, I have performed a number of operations. Let me show this to you. Here are the scanned copies of my pictures of my hands. If I do this, notice that there is no bilateral symmetry. You cannot see the congruence. To see the congruence, you can't see it that way either. You need to rotate, and not only that, you have to do this, okay, and do this. So I performed many geometric operations. I have done this. I rotate this way, I rotate this way, and there is translation, movement. So you can describe actually bilateral symmetry in terms of these transformations. Okay, you can also describe that kind of symmetry not only in terms of the movement of the objects, but also in terms of the perceiver. So, for example, flipping is this. Okay, but you can get the same effect if you move from this position to this position. So you change the observer's frame of reference, you get exactly the same result. Right. I'm trying to describe the symmetry of something, visual symmetry in terms of observer versus object. And that gives you a different understanding of symmetry. Okay. So we have to go beyond bilateral symmetry. Let me see if I can go back to. Sorry about that. Okay, I got it. So let me go back to homology. What exactly is homology? we have already seen some instances of homology in when we said parrots or when we said mammals. So there is a kind of homology is that which is invariant under variability. So there is a homology. If you take my two hands, there is some similarity, some shared characteristics of my hands. Let's say my hands have 10 fingers, and hands have certain kinds of structures and so on. If I take my arms and my legs have certain common structural patterns. This is not what biologists would call homology, but notice that this is symmetry within an organism in terms of the organs and organ systems and so on. And we can extend the use of the term homology to not only to patterns across species, that which is invariant across species, but also that which is invariant within an organism. So now you have homology expanded to symmetry. Okay, what is symmetry? What is homology? They mean the same thing. You can have invariance and variability across taxa. That is one kind of symmetry. That is what is called homology in evolutionary biology. But you can also talk about invariance and variability within a species. So it could be at the level of the phenotypical characteristics. It could be at the level of cellular characteristics. It could be at the level of molecular characteristics. All of these are symmetry. Viewed that way, symmetry becomes the core enterprise of scientific inquiry. We want to identify how we want to understand the invariance and variability in nature, in all aspects of nature. And we want to construct theories of invariance and variability. And that is essentially almost the whole of theoretical science, understanding nature from that perspective. It's not a small thing, it's a huge thing. It allows you to start constructing theories by saying, what is it that is invariant under variability? And you construct theories to explain that. Whether you call it symmetry or homology, it doesn't matter. Okay, let's try this. The way to understand, Anirban talked about chemistry, symmetry in chemistry at the quantum mechanical level. But as far as school students are concerned, what we have here is symmetry. A chemical balancing of chemical equation is based on symmetry. What is the symmetry here? Well, balancing of chemical equation simply means the atoms on the left-hand side of the equation should be the same as atoms on the right-hand side of the equation. So there is symmetry of the number of atoms in a molecule. In the input and the output. The molecules may change. The structure of the molecules may change, but the number of atoms remains invariant. Okay. And that's symmetry at the molecular level. You can talk about symmetry at many different levels. Okay. Here, what happens is, this is symmetry in chemical change. In the case of symmetry in animals and living organisms, we are talking about symmetry in structure without time. But here there is a process. Chemical change means process. So symmetry exists in both structure and change. So if you want to construct theories, you can look at the world both in terms of structure and in terms of change, and ask the question, what is it that is invariant? Whether it is change or structure, it doesn't matter. Okay. So far, okay. Before I go on to linguistics, this part needs to be quite clear. Any questions about those? Please ask. All right. We'll now move on to theoretical linguistics. Okay, let me explain what theoretical linguists do in terms of data, experiments, and so on, for you to get a sense of what linguistics is. So take a look at these four sentences. I'm talking about the structure of sentences in terms of words. So what you have here is the first line has a string of words. That boy has been annoying the girls. And if I ask speakers of English, is this an acceptable sentence? You would say yes. Okay. So imagine, for example, experimental subject sitting in a lab and looking at the computer screens. and they are given two buttons saying yes or no. And their job is to press the button when they think that the stimulus that they have on the computer screen is an acceptable sentence, but no when the stimulus is not acceptable. So what you're doing here is some kind of stimulus response experiments on human beings. Very similar to the kind of stimulus response experiments on animals or stimulus response experiments on, let's say, pendulums. Makes no difference. You're looking at the behavior by doing something to the entity that you're studying. That's what you do in science when you do experiments. Okay. But if I give you this sentence, that has boy been annoying the girls, the experimental subjects are going to press no. That boy has annoying the girls, they will press no, and so on. So the only string of words where they would say yes would be the first one. Everything else they would say no. That's your data. And asymmetry in actually the same words, and yet when you change the order, the result is unacceptable. So what the theoretical linguist wants to do is to find out why the first sentence is acceptable and the other three things are not acceptable. This is essentially what people like us do. You do experiments on human beings, and we want to explain why they behave in certain ways and not in some other ways. That's what, in a nutshell, what theoretical linguistics is about. To do that, what do we do? The experimentation part. To explain why they behave differently, what we do is use these tools of what are called representations and laws. We represent structures, the structure of sentences, for example, in terms of words. And we also postulate laws of structure. This is exactly like what chemists do. They represent molecules, the structure of molecules in terms of atoms, and they set up laws that govern how atoms are combined to form molecules. So they say things like, if you have oxygen atoms and hydrogen atoms, two of these hydrogen atoms can combine with one oxygen atom. The reverse, two oxygen atoms with one hydrogen atom cannot combine. So those are the laws of structural combinations. And linguists do the same kind of stuff. Representations of...
Yeah. Can I interrupt for a second one?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Please.
So, I just was making sure that, Shuli, 1 minute. So then I guess you're saying that the entire project of theoretical linguistics is just this, to kind of figure out whether certain sentence structures are right, and humans, how they respond to that. Is that
no, I was just giving a small part of the kind of linguistics that we do. Theoretical linguistics is much more than that. We also study how language is acquired by children, how languages change, how language structure is connected to the neural correlates of language pathology. There's a whole bunch of things that we do. I was giving a very small fragment of theoretical linguistics that can be understood. I wasn't trying to give, the whole range of linguistics. That'll be a 6-hour talk.
Okay. No. Yeah. Just making sure. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Go ahead.
When we teach linguistics in a first-year class, we begin with this.
I see.
Because it's easy to understand. Right. But the rest of the stuff will take the understanding of structure, how that structure comes to exist in the human mind, how that structure changes in social change, how that structure is connected to the brain, how that structure, and all kinds of things. So there is mathematical linguistics, neurolinguistics, language pathology, a whole bunch of other things.
Okay.
So this is just one fragment. Yeah. I'm glad that you asked the question, because I would have misrepresented the whole enterprise.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah. So let me explain what I mean by structural representation. So notice that if you remember, the first sentence was grammatical, acceptable, that the other strings were not acceptable. How do linguists take care of such things? I mentioned structural representation and structural laws. So here is an example of structural representation. You don't have to know exactly what these things mean, but let me briefly say the top one, S, is declarative sentence. Okay. And on the left, there is NP, which means noun phrase. On the right, there is VP, which means verb phrase, and so on and so on. You don't really have to know what these things are. Essentially, what you need to understand is what you have there in purple line, the labels and so on, is actually a graph theoretic representation. There are these nodes, okay, which are units, nodes or vertices, units of sentence, which will be sentence, phrase, word. Then these are categorized. So NP is a category, noun phrase is a category, noun is a category, verb is a category. Okay, so these units are categorized. So what you have there is a representation of the compositionality of units and the categories of each of those units. You also have a kind of representation of the temporal order. So compositionality and order are represented in that graph theoretic representation. What I want to emphasize is that the representations that we use are discrete representations, not continuous. Okay, structure requires categorical units, categorical conception of things. And this is going to be important when you look at structure in biology as well. In chemistry also, when they look at structure, it's actually discrete representation. But when you think of change, you move from discrete to the continuous. But there are also cases where you can think of change also in terms of discrete representations. So that's a representation. And we represent sentences in many different ways. Then you state laws governing those representations or laws governing structure. So law number 1 is declarative sentence is composed of a noun phrase and a verb phrase. Okay. Law 2, an NP, the noun phrase is composed of an optional determiner and a noun in that order. Notice that each of these laws tell you in that order. So they tell you two things. One is what a unit is composed of and what the order of the subunits are. You can actually separate them. And in most linguistic theories, you separate the compositionality part from the ordering part in fairly complex ways, but I'm not going to do that here. Now, if you have all these laws, the 4 laws here, then you can explain why those 3 things, the second, third, and fourth strings, are unacceptable because they violate some of these laws. So the basic idea is that human beings speakers of languages have these implicit unconscious laws in their mind. And what linguists are trying to do is to figure out what those laws are. Okay, and the idea is that if any of those laws are violated, the speakers would reject the sentence as unacceptable. But if it is consistent with their mental laws, they will say yes. So this is the way of investigating what exists in the mind by modeling the mind in terms of explicit ways. This comes from Alan Turing, actually, what we are trying to do. All right. So representations and laws is a way of understanding what exists in the human mind as language faculty. That's what we do. So far, okay? All right. Now, let's, with this in mind, let's look at symmetry in linguistics. Okay.
So, Mohanan, sorry if I may ask one more thing then.
Uh-huh.
So I guess then you're implying that that this is completely biological and has no social dimension to it, right? And that assumption is fair.
No, we are not saying it is completely biological. The biological part will be neurolinguistics, but we are studying the mind as we could say mind is an emergent property of the brain. This is cognitive science, not neuroscience. There is also cognitive neuroscience, which studies the interaction between the brain and the mind.
Okay, got it.
We look at ourselves as investigators of the mind.
Right.
And the model implicit in what I'm saying is Turing's model that the mind can be studied as a computer.
Yeah. Stop.
Was there another question?
No. So I guess because you say the mind, that's where some factors beyond just biology are coming in, right? And that is, you're making a distinction between brain and mind, right?
Brain and mind, also society and mind, they interact. There is an interaction between neuroscience and mind. There is also an interaction between mind and society.
Right.
So I'm just taking the mind part, but once that is done, we have to look at these interactions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
So there are little brain impairments which will cause huge changes in the human language faculty. So, to give you a small example, a specific kind of brain impairment can make you lose the passive construction. So you can understand John hit Bill, but if you say Bill was hit by John, you will think that Bill is the agent of hitting.
Okay.
We
I
study
see.
those brain impairments, language pathologies, all kinds of things.
Okay.
This is where the interactions, happen. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
So to turn to symmetry, invariance, and the variability, the homology in linguistics. There are two kinds of homologies that we study. I'm using the word homology and symmetry as synonyms. I'll keep switching between these two so that you get a sense of what I'm trying to communicate. In these two sentences, look at this. Mary insulted Bill. Bill was insulted by Mary, the passive construction. Notice that the words Mary, Bill, and insult are the same, but there are differences in the word order. There are also differences in that the second one has a was and also has a by extra. So in spite of all these differences, there is also something that is common. Namely, in both sentences, Mary is the agent and Bill is the victim of insult. That is the symmetry. But notice that the subject in the first sentence is Mary and the subject of the second sentence is Bill. So that's where they are different. So there is invariance, there is also variability. This kind of invariance and variability of sentences is called alternation in linguistics, but alternation is a kind of symmetry, is a kind of homology within a language of sentences. So it can be alternation of sentences or words or syllables or sounds, any pairing, related things, related units. Let me give you one more example of alternation. Mary gave a book to Bill, and Mary gave Bill a book. So the difference here is that in the first sentence, a book is the first object, but in the second case, Bill is the first object. But notice that there is something that is invariant, namely, the person who gives the book is Mary, the receiver is Bill, and what is received is a book. So that's a symmetry. And people who study alternations want to explain this invariance and variability. Notice that this is very similar to saying that carbon molecules are manifested as diamond or as coal, right? Or as graphite. Graphite and diamond are two different manifestations, the variability, but the carbon molecule is that which is invariant. So you could think of this as manifestation of the same thing, which is also the same as the same tune, the same theme in different shapes. Right? Okay, so this is a case of symmetry in terms of alternation, that is relation between sentences within the same speaker or within the same, you might say, linguistic species. This is one of the things that we study. Now, when you move from what happens inside a linguistic species, inside a language, to across languages, and when I say across languages, I'm talking about if a language is like a species, I'm talking about what happens across linguistic species. There are patterns, invariances across species. And these patterns, that kind of symmetry is called universals in linguistics. So let me take some examples. We took the passive construction earlier and we said that even though there are these two types of sentences, okay, in agent and undergoer remain the same. The difference is that in one case, agent is the subject. In the other case, agent is a non-subject. In one case, the undergoer is the object in the active construction, but in the passive, undergoer is the subject. So this is the relation between the active construction and the passive construction. When you look at other languages, the active and passive constructions, you find exactly the same thing. Whether it is Hindi or English or Greek or Malayalam, it doesn't matter. So this core is invariant across languages. Okay? I'm not saying that every language has active and passive constructions, but a large number of unrelated languages have this. And these are called universals. Now, even in the case of universals, there are differences. So, for example, the passive construction in Japanese has meanings which are not present in English. So, for example, you can say John was promoted by Bill. Is okay in Japanese, the passive. But John was, let us say, demoted by Bill, or John was imprisoned by Bill. I'm sorry, the other way around. Passive involves something bad happening to the undergoer. So the other way around, like you can say John was imprisoned, but John was promoted. That is not something bad, so you can't say that in Japanese. So there are all kinds of subtle differences, but the core part of what I've given here on the screen remains. Right. So we study the universals in this fashion. Universals are the homologies across species, or symmetries across linguistic species. Let me give you one more example, or two more actually. Take the sentence, Mary's mother admires herself. Now we have to go slow. And ask yourself, what does herself refer to? Does it refer to Mary? Is it that Mary's mother admires Mary? Or Mary's mother admires the mother? You'll say the mother, okay? But if you say Mary's mother admires her, the her refers to Mary, not the mother. So one of the things that linguists ask is, what are the laws governing these relationships? Herself is called a reflexive. Okay, what are the laws governing the way reflexives refer to their antecedents? So we know that it can refer to Mary's mother, but not Mary. If you say that Mary's mother was awarded a prize, was reported to herself, that is ungrammatical. Why? Because the reflexive herself cannot refer to this time either to Mary or to Mary's mother. How come? In the first sentence you could, in the second sentence you can't. The reason is very simple. Mary's mother is inside a whole clause, and the reflexive cannot look inside. Okay, this is very common across languages, not just English. You can look at the languages that you speak, you will find the same thing. And there is another similar thing which is called reciprocal. Each other is a reciprocal. So if you say the boys admire each other's girlfriends, what that means is if the boys are, let's say John and Bill, John admires Bill's girlfriends and Bill admires John's girlfriends. Okay, so boys is the antecedent of each other. This time, each other's antecedent is the subject, the boys. But if you say the king gave the slaves to each other, this is a kind of, not the kind of sentence that you normally hear, but linguists construct these odd sentences to figure out the structure. This is hardly ever a sentence that you would speak. But notice that you can interpret this. Okay, there is a king and there are two slaves, X and Y. And the king gave X to Y and Y to X. That's a perfectly, understandable mythological situation. The mother of the boys talked to the teacher about each other. Okay, is that possible? In terms of actual meaning, that is possible. There are two boys, X and Y. Okay, and the mother talked to the teacher. Okay, teachers about. Teacher X's teacher, mother talked to Y. I'm sorry. What I mean to say is this: there is X's teacher and Y's teacher, and the mother talked about X to Y's teacher and about Y to X's teacher. This is conceivable meaning, but you can't get that meaning because of the restriction that each other has a similar thing. You cannot look inside a unit. Okay, you may not have fully understood all these things because some of these structural patterns will require a whiteboard or green board, but you get a rough idea of what I mean by universal. Some of these restrictions are across the board, across languages. If you look at the same kinds of things in Malayalam, for example, in English there is a restriction which says that the reflexive must find an antecedent in the same clause. In Malayalam, it can find the antecedent across clauses upstairs. So if you compare Malayalam and English and Hindi and Greek and Icelandic and so on, certain general patterns begin to emerge, and they look very much like biological homologies in biology. So if you look deep, you find that structural patterns in biology, homologies in biology, are very, very similar to homologies in linguistics. Why am I saying this? because the kinds of theoretical tools that you get from one place can be used in another. Ways of looking at homology in biology can inform the way we look at homology in linguistics, and the way we construct explanations for homologies in linguistics can inform, can help those who want to construct theories in biology. By looking at symmetry across these different domains, what we are doing is learning certain common patterns across disciplines so that we can have synergies across disciplines. Okay? So universals in linguistics, in other words, symmetry, homology, they mean the same thing, of constructions, symmetry of constructions and relations across linguistic species, and within biology, symmetry, homology of organs, organ systems and functions across biological species. I didn't talk about organs and organ systems, but this is easy. If you look at, for example, the organ called heart and the variability of heart across species, or the organ called vertebra and the variability of vertebrae across species. So even though they vary considerably, there is also symmetry. Okay, or beak. What is it that beaks have in common? That is symmetry. How do they vary? So studying invariance and variability is a central program in all disciplines, especially scientific inquiry. And the way of thinking about these in terms of symmetry, homology, in terms of invariance and variability, in terms of allomorphy. There are different words that people use, but it's really, they all mean the same thing. If you have listened to Janaganamana, the different versions of Janaganamana by A.R. Rahman, you know what symmetry means. It is variations of the same tune. There are differences in the way, for example, Bhimsen Joshi sings or Patamal sings, but you can see, you can hear the same tune across all these. That is essentially symmetry. Thank you. Questions? I'm happy to receive questions. Yeah.
So you told about the laws, some 4 or 5 laws and representations. Mm-hmm. So are these laws constant across all languages, or are there variations when you move in?
Some laws are exactly the same. So there is a law which says that if there is a pronoun in the object position, it cannot refer to its own subject. That is exactly the same law that applies across. But there are laws about relation between, let's say, reflexives and their antecedents. There are some variations, but the laws have a common core of symmetry, and they're also they account for both the invariance and the variability. Yeah.
I think there are some more questions in the chat box.
Will somebody have to say the questions? I cannot see the questions. Yeah.
So, Mohanan, one question I was wondering is, how many laws are there? Are there a lot of laws, or are there a limited set of few laws?
Okay. You see, the spirit of inquiry that linguistics has comes from physics. So we want to reduce all the different kinds of laws into, unify the laws into a single small set of laws. That's a dream. Okay, unification is a dream. It doesn't always work. Okay, okay. There are cases where we try our best and it doesn't work. Okay, this is exactly the same case. Quantum mechanics and relativity, people are still dreaming about unification. It's not clear, what happens. And in the case of linguistics, it is only linguistics started in 1957, 56, 57. The theoretical linguistics program that I'm talking about, with Noam Chomsky, inspired by Alan Turing on the one hand, and Panini on the other. Mm-hmm. So, looking back, we could say we have had considerable success, but are we satisfied? No, we are still struggling. Mm-hmm. So let me separate the dream of unification to as few as possible to the actual reality. And when you look at actual, linguistic research, there are too many of them. And that's very frustrating. And we can see that there are patterns which are common, but we are not able to capture them as meaningful laws.
Okay.
And one of the reasons possibly could be we are using the wrong kind of formalisms. You cannot use set theory or even just Euclidean geometry to explain the facts of, the sky. You need some other kind of system. and we still haven't been able to come up with the right kind of formalism. We have been experimenting with those too. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So this is Arun's question.
Uh-huh.
Are these structures preserved across languages? And in a given language, does it stay?
The hardcore things which are universal, truly universal in the sense exactly the same, they don't change. The totally invariant. But there are also variable universals. As I mentioned, for example, the reflexive and the reciprocal. Those things undergo changes. So, for example, the subject-verb agreement in Hindi, for example, they can undergo changes. Certain patterns, phonological patterns can undergo changes. So there is also a kind of, not exactly revolutionary processes, but historical change can happen, things can, But within, you have to think of this as the language faculty or the universal grammar provides a space in which these changes can happen. It cannot happen outside of that space. So this is why we want to study that space. What we have here is a kind of multi-dimensional space where there are laws and the changes happen within that space. A good way of thinking about this is the epigenetic landscape in biology. So the way epigenetic landscape is conceptualized is that of this. Imagine, for example, a mountain, and you're on top of the mountain, you have a ball, and you drop the ball. You cannot predict the exact path that the ball will traverse, but you can say it will be somewhere down below at that region. You can also predict possible paths it might take, and you are able to predict that because of the topology of the mountain. So the same thing happens in linguistics. There is a multidimensional space, and this is constrained space, heavily constrained. Constrained randomness is what we call it. Okay, because space is actually that of non-linear dynamics. I don't want to go into the details of any of those things, but that's the way we conceptualize it. And capturing that invariance under variability requires all these different ways of thinking about invariance and variability across domains. I don't know if I answered that question. The brief answer is yes, changes do take place, but only within a constrained manner.
So this is Sanskar's question. How does such a structure naturally evolve to be in every language around the world?
Sorry, say that again.
How does such a structure naturally evolve to be in every language around the world?
If the question is how did that kind of structure come to exist in the human species, the answer is we don't know. We would like to find out. In fact, there are lots of linguists who are trying to find out, but it is very hard to get the relevant evidence, because if you look at the transition from the non-human to the human, we have all these things about bones and stuff like that, but we don't really know exactly what happened in the brain. Unless we understand the brain structure, it will be very hard to speculate about those things. But a few things are clear, that the origin of language coincided with the development of symbolic systems, symbolic thought that humans are capable of. There are certain important differences between humans and other primates, and those coincide with the emergence of language in the human species. But the origin of language is about as murky as the origin of life. This is largely an ill-understood question. Maybe 50 years from now, we might be able to get a better answer. But that doesn't mean people are not working on it. There are lots and lots of people who are working on it. We are struggling. But the answer is we don't know. Ignorance is far more than knowledge in that domain.
Maybe maybe Sanskar should clarify this, but the question could also be that because the way it is typed, it says how does such a structure naturally evolve to be in every language around the world? So I don't know whether the person is meaning whether Where does this universals, how do they come about? I don't know. Sanskar, you should clarify.
So this question is exactly like the same question in biology, homology, right? If you look at the homologies of, let us say, of the shape of the skeleton of birds, hands and legs of humans, and so on, we find a certain homology. So that we could ask, how did this homology come to exist in these vertebrates? The standard answer in biology is evolution. Okay, we had a single structure, and in the course of reproduction, inheritance, there was descent with modification, and that is how it came to be. This is the Darwinian story. But we also know that that is not the only reason. There is also convergent evolution. Okay. Not simply descent with, if you look at thorns, for example, thorns appear in many different species without a single ancestor. Eyes came about in various species without a single ancestor. There are many of them, and a large number of biologists are now looking at convergent evolution, not simply the descent with modification. That is another explanation. There is also borrowing, which is rampant in, for example, bacteria across. So this is lateral transfer of genes. These are three mechanisms in biology, but the preferred mechanism in biology is that of descent with modification, the ancestry story. The preferred mechanism in linguistics, on the other hand, is that there is a kind of infrastructure of genes and brain that shapes the emergence of patterns in the language, in different languages. So this is like saying that we prefer the story with convergent evolution. But then when we argue for that, we have to show that it cannot be explained in terms of ancestry, that is historical linguistics, and it cannot be explained in terms of borrowing. So, for example, English has words like pandit, but these are words were borrowed from Indian languages. Then you're also relations between, for example, English and Hindi, or English and Indian languages, or German, and so on. So there's a correspondence between father and pita, okay, brother and bhrata. But these have been clearly shown to be of historical linguistics, that they had a common source language, Proto-Indo-European, and they diverged into Germanic and English, and on this side, Indic languages like Hindi, Bengali, Sanskrit, and so on. So we have to show that this is not because of ancestry, and we have to show that this is not because of borrowing, lateral transfer. Then we say, okay, now this must be because of the properties of the human brain mind. That's the story that linguists tell. Of course, there is another consideration, namely, not because of the properties of brain, not because of ancestry, but because of the environment. So that also has to be taken care of. We have to show that these common properties are not because of the common properties of the environment. Again, all these considerations apply to both biology and linguistics. The study of homology, we face the same kinds of problems. So if I were to construct a curriculum for an undergraduate program, I would do linguistics and biology as a single subject. Since
does anyone have any other question?
Right. If you have questions, don't hesitate to, that I'm always available through email. So email me. Everybody knows my email address.
Sanskar does have a question.
Who?
Sanskar.
Okay.
Is there any evidence that Proto-Indo-European was actually a thing?
There is, of course, evidence. So the question that you're asking is, how good is that evidence? Right? So this is like asking, is there any evidence that Big Bang existed? Well, there is evidence, and you can ask me or ask a physicist, how good is that evidence? Is there any evidence to show that humans and bacteria and chimpanzees and snakes and trees evolved from a single ancestor? Yes, there is evidence. But when you ask the question, how good is that evidence? That's a separate thing. we have to look at the details of the evidence and the argumentation. So the evidence was accumulated in the 19th century. It's pretty good evidence, actually. I'm just stating my opinion. To convince you that the evidence is good, I have to take you through the evidence and argumentation. That'll be something like a 4-week project. It's not answerable in like 2 minutes. But that also applies to exactly the same thing about the Darwinian story. How good is that evidence? You have to examine Darwinian theory carefully, look at the arguments, the evidence, and critically evaluate it. That's worthwhile, but it'll take some time. Okay, it looks like
Any questions?
yeah. So if there are no more questions, you can. As I said, you can still, if you think of questions at night when you're falling asleep, you can send me questions on email. I will definitely respond. All right. This was fun. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mo, for the really interesting talk.
Thank you.
For most as a students, linguistics isn't something that they